Hello. So, I decided to make a video about my experiences with the Seeing White podcast. So, I had previously listened to this podcast, and I think what sticks out with me this time that I'm listening to it the most is the fact that it's like reading a book, and that you read it the first time, and certain things stick out to you. And then you read it again, and different things stick out to you. And then you read it again, and more things stick out to you. And so it's kind of like each time you read it or each time you hear it, you're taking something different from it. And I didn't expect to have that experience with this podcast. I expected to have the experience of having a group of people to discuss it with and to hear their reactions to. And that part I have really enjoyed, but I also have really enjoyed getting a different perspective from it this time. Like the last time I listened to it, for some reason, it didn't stick out to me as much. The episode about how certain towns were made all white overnight. And this time, for some reason, that episode really stuck out to me. And so I decided to do a little bit of a deep dive with my own hometown, because my own hometown that I came from is a small suburb within a larger suburb. So I grew up in Falls Church City, which is right outside of Fairfax County. And Fairfax County is very multicultural, very diverse, has a lot of flavor to it. Falls Church is this smaller, much more kind of exclusive area. And there is a Falls Church High School, which is really interesting. But the Falls Church High School is not in Falls Church. So you do a little digging about Falls Church and its history, and basically what you discover is the school system itself was created independently from the Fairfax County school system because the parents and the citizens of this specific area didn't like the idea of their students, their children, going to these integrated schools. So they created a smaller school system within the larger school system, so it was still legal, but it became the Falls Church City school system. And just due to redlining and where the school system was and drew from, it created this much smaller, whiter school system within this larger school system. So I grew up going to a very small school, one elementary school, one middle school, one high school, graduated with about 100 kids. But we all knew that there was something weird because one, we went to George Mason High School in the Falls Church City school system, but it was located in Fairfax County. Interesting. But we also knew that there was this Falls Church High School, but the Falls Church High School was in Fairfax County. And so we never really thought about it or did any, research or did any kind of anything about it, because we just were like, well, our parents live in Falls Church, so we go to the Falls Church schools, city schools. But when you look into the history of it, it's a very sordid history that created it. So, like I said, we grew up knowing that we went to a school where you could count the number of minorities in school and you knew them by name versus literally 3 miles down the road was a very large high school in Fairfax County that was very diverse, had lots of different ethnicities and lots of different types of students. And there is still this perception that Falls Church City schools are amazing and wonderful and how great they are. And they're not bad, but they're no better than Fairfax County schools. But they are still to this day significantly whiter. And so this time around, as I was listening to the Seeing White podcast, what stuck out to me was, number one, the episode about how certain towns and counties and cities became the way they are. But also just thinking about my experiences growing up and going to elementary school, middle school, and high school, and how I had these conversations with my parents at home because I was very lucky to grow up in a home where my parents were very open and had discussions about what was going on in the real world throughout the day, and they discussed politics and religion and everything around the table. But many of the people that I went to school with did not. So I grew up very unsheltered in terms of the conversations and the information that I was gaining, but in a very sheltered school. And it's just never occurred to me. Like, I always knew there was something weird to the fact that we were this small school system for some reason that existed in the middle, like smack in the middle of this larger school system. But looking back now and having heard this podcast really made me want to investigate a lot more. And it's a shame, I feel like, because I want everyone to have to listen to this podcast. I want everyone to find themselves a gender eye, because I feel like part of what is happening today is not because of a intentional situation, but because of a you don't know what you don't know. And there are so many people that just grew up not getting a complete view of history, getting it from only one perspective, only one side. They didn't have parents that were interested like I was and my parents were in having just adult conversations around the dinner table. And they also don't have, like I do and like the people in this cohort do, a sense of wanting to learn more and know more. There's so many people out there that are non-educators that are like, well, yeah, I learned everything I needed to know in middle school and in high school, and now I'm good. And now I'm going to go about my life, and I'm going to be a good person. I'm going to be a good white person. That was another thing that I kept bumping into within this podcast, and I didn't think about before, but the amount of people that I'm surrounded by that are good white people and would say to you, well, I'm not one of them. I'm a good white person. And they are, but they are not fully aware and acknowledging of the systems that they're a part of and the fact that they are unknowingly participating in larger systems of racism still, and that they may not be racist, but these systems that they are involved in are perpetuating the idea of racism, and that you don't have to be a racist in order to participate in racism. So that was like the biggest piece that I took away was the fact that this time I did a lot more of introspection and digging into kind of the people that I am surrounded by and the school system and the way in which I grew up. And I continue to tell anyone and everyone that I meet, hey, have you heard of Scene on Radio? You should really listen to this podcast. I will actually probably wind up listening to this podcast again in a few months and getting something completely different from it again. I feel like it's kind of, for me, like my experience was with REI, where I keep going back as an alumni, and every time I go, I pick out new nuggets of information. So I'm really appreciative, and I guess appreciative of the experience and being able to go through this podcast again, but having these colleagues and you, Christina, especially, to go through and kind of guide us through some of the questions and pushing to action thoughts and making us think a little bit, dig a little bit deeper and harder about ourselves. And I really do appreciate this whole experience.